Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for having me. I'm here to talk to you today about the global perspectives around human trafficking. And although I don't understand Spanish, I understand that Oscar has just told you about my background. So I want to talk to you today about, about the types of exploitation we see and some of the things that can be done to stop it, but also looking from a victimological point of view, because we're always trying to prevent the crime happening instead of solving the crime in the end. On your screen is just some of my working background. I did serve in the military for a number of years in the Air Force. And I suppose for me, importantly, all of my work is practical. So although I am academic, I get to work in the field, which is very good for me. I just put this warning because I will speak to you about the victim's account, and some of it can sound be distressing. So just please, if you have any concerns, contact Oscar or just turn down the volume. So the fields of exploitation that I am involved in are particularly those for sexual exploitation and of labour. However, we do study all of those that you see on the screen. What is not here is the cybercrime. So this is a very new area for us in Australia where stalking, identity theft, and targeting victims using cyber platforms such as social networking, job-seeking networking and platforms, and so on. So, human trafficking, as you would know, is a global issue that transcends all of our borders, affecting countries and regions all over the world. This illicit trade involves the exploitation of individuals through force, coercion, deception, for the purposes of sexual exploitation and forced labour. It is a deeply entrenched problem with far-reaching consequences, not only for the primary victim, but for the society and communities at large. One of the key challenges in addressing human trafficking lies in understanding the various perspectives that different regions bring. In Australia, we are part of Southeast Asia. In many parts of Asia, human trafficking remains a significant problem. It is fueled by factors such as poverty, lack of education, and political instability. In some of the Asian nations that I visit, the children leave school around 7 years of age. So they do not have an opportunity to understand critical thinking, to develop language skills. In many cases, the children become illiterate of their own language. Countries like Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam are what we know as hotspots for trafficking because they have vulnerable populations lured by the promise of a better economic opportunity, only to find themselves trapped in exploitive situations. The demand for cheap labour and for the sex trades exacerbate the issues, create a complex web of criminal networking, and exploit the desperation of the individuals that are seeking a way out of chronic poverty. If we move to Europe, The influx of migrants and refugees has led to a surge in human trafficking, particularly in the same forms of sexual servitude and forced labour. The diverse social economic landscape of this continent means that trafficking manifests differently in different countries, with Eastern Europe facing higher incidences of labour exploitation, whilst Western Europe grapples with sex trafficking. In the Americas, the dynamic of human trafficking varies widely, from trafficking of women and girls for sexual exploitation in Latin America to the exploitations of labour within North America. The United States, for instance, grapples with both domestic and international trafficking. Unfortunately, in the past, academia and practitioners have considered trafficking of humans across international borders only. We now consider internal trafficking a significant problem, particularly in the United States. Moreover, the complex issues around human trafficking is further compounded by interconnected problems in relation to the drug trade, to organised crime. In Africa, human trafficking is often entwined with other forms of organised crime, such as arms smuggling, drug trafficking, and terrorism, where we understand that the criminals use the same methods to traffic humans as they do for weapons and drugs. Countries in conflict and post-conflict situations are particularly vulnerable, with displaced populations facing heightened risks of exploitation. Furthermore, child trafficking for the purposes of soldiers, forced labour and sex is critically of a concern in the African continent. The definition that I use is from the World Health Organization. You can see it on the screen. It is a very broad definition, but for the purposes of this presentation, I will talk specifically related to the sex crimes and the forced labour bondage. Internationally, sexual exploitation accounts for approximately 80% of all humans trafficked. This must include men and boys. They are often excluded from commentary around sexual exploitation. For trafficking for the purposes of labour, again, globally, around the 20%. As I have stated, some countries suffer with a higher level of labour exploitation, but across the world, it is approximately 20%. From the modern day perspective of the modern day form of slavery involves the illegal trade of people for the exploitation and commercial gain. And this is critical because we must understand that part of the prevention of human trafficking is revaluing, the human, the person, against what people can profit from. In terms of the person themselves, they are usually very vulnerable, have little to no paper or identification documents. They are often coerced as opposed to physically forced. And it is a lucrative business where traffickers can make around about $400 million a day. I have this slide in relation to the kind of costs evaluated against the Super Bowl, which I understand is very popular in America and in your area of the world, but it should give you an idea of the kind of money we're talking about. In terms of putting it into perspective, if we think about the sexual exploitation, we have to consider the main victims of this exploitation are women and girls. This is usually fed from the need of the sexual commercial sexual industry, such as pornography and prostitution. The important part is to understand why people consider not necessary to sell a human being, but in terms of its costing, how tragically affordable a human being is. So we ask ourselves, why women and why girls? And here you see this infographic. Globally, 1 in 5 of the victims trafficked are children, and women make up the 2/3 of those trafficked. The vast majority of these females are young. They are lured with false promises of employment, but often raped, drugged, and imprisoned. There is violence and threats of violence imposed on them, large sums of debt also, and almost always, certainly in Australia, their passport and their papers are confiscated. Once the person who is holding them, the criminal, has taken photographs or film of them being sexually exploited, they then use this film or photographs and images to blackmail them, to keep them quiet, so that they will not try to escape to return to their family. In terms of men and boys, they are also victims of sexual exploitation, although more so for forced labour, forced begging, and child soldiers. I have added this slide from a point of interest for myself, which I thought I would share with you. The original concept of the ideal victim was created by Niels Christie in 1986. He had this concept that you can see on screen, that the ideal victim was a weaker, younger person who was not doing anything wrong, who was attacked by someone bigger, older, and criminal. The reason that I raise this is that it is legitimate victims, a legitimate status being given to victims if they are young or old, female and innocent. However, when we talk about a vulnerable, defenseless person, being a woman who is trafficked, sometimes there are arguments from law enforcement and from our community, well, I wouldn't have done this, or how were they so silly that they got caught? How come they didn't leave, and things. And so we are now trying to revisit this idea and teach people that that it is not the fault of the victim that they become trafficked and harmed. So, So I have this infographic here in relation to what it looks like in terms of a timeline, if you like. This comes from the Canadian Human Trafficking. However, it is very common to see this process, if you like. The sex industry more often starts with luring the person in, often online today, for the purposes of either a very good job with much better money, or an intent to have a relationship with this person for long-term marriage and so on. At the point where the offender and the victim is now corresponding, they may receive gifts or money or compliments and other things. At that point, the process starts where the offender will start to talk and try to isolate the victim away from friends and loved ones, and if they are working, from their colleagues. Once this has occurred, and again it takes time, manipulation and coercion can occur. If you consider a person such as a female who has been trafficked, you're talking about some of the most poor, inadequately educated or employed women in the world. There is racial discrimination as a consideration, religious intolerance, and discrimination against these women. So the coercion becomes easier when the offender has manipulated them into believing different things, and they are now away from people who could normally protect them. The exploitation is, of course, the last element of this, in that they are then set to work in commercial sex industries. If you can imagine the shame of being filmed or photographed against your will. I make no judgment against those who choose this industry, but when you do not choose it, many of our victims feel that they cannot return home to their family because of the shame and guilt. So, as I have spoken about, the majority of the risk factors that you will see here on the screen are, many of them are blended together in one person. The more risk factors there are, the higher the risk is for the person to be trafficked. Excuse me. The concept of a victim being misled or forced used to be around organised crime. This, of course, is still true. There are large networks of organised criminals that are using networks around the world, across borders and internally as well, to victimize individuals. However, some of my more recent research is showing that there are more and more just individual groups of people, or individual people, that are becoming involved in the offence of human trafficking and modern slavery. I should talk a little about that later. So, in terms of the risks and losses, for all trafficking victims, I have on the left-hand side of this screen, or slide, most people will suffer with these and be at risk of these. In Australia, we see things such as the lack of medical attention and malnourishment in people that are on in our remote areas on farms working. And I will show you a picture later. You will see what I mean. But on the right-hand side of the screen, some of the more common losses and risks for females is unwanted pregnancies and unsafe abortions, but more specifically, and one that I see more commonly, is the STD, which is a sexually transmitted disease, or STI, the sexually transmitted infection. This is a far more common problem, which can affect fertility for the victim in the future. So I utilized this map to show you. It comes from the United Nations Highlights in Human Trafficking, and it shows us the origin or destination countries. You can see here where you live in Mexico and where I live in Australia. For us, we are mainly rated as a destination country. Very sadly for our community, the men in Australia are some of the highest users of child exploitation material, which is both shameful and something I will work my career to prevent. I show you a closer map of Australia to show you for our purposes of where we receive victims of human trafficking from. This money made from the human trafficking rivals that drug traffickers and illegal arms traders will make. Trafficking for us is $10 billion a year enterprise. In Australia, we believe there are more than 19,000 slaves currently living and working here. And we understand that around 800,000 people move between these countries and these borders annually. Oh, sorry. For the purposes of, this is from an Australian point of view, these are the significant issues we find in trying to identify our victims. One of the issues is that in many of the previous reports and on Google and in photographs and images, we see people with scars and binding and bruising. And I think this has altered the way we think we can identify a victim, because the general public looks for a person who is physically injured or physically tied. The truth is, for the majority of slaves and human trafficking victims here in Australia, there is very few with physical injuries. If you think about the industry that they work in, such as prostitution, the owners of these prostitutes do not want their women scarred or marked because they are less saleable and they will make less profit. As tragic as that is, this is true. The other thing is that although the injuries are rarer, we do see multiple injuries when we do have a person come to a medical centre. We often see signs of malnourishment where the person is so unwell, have been chronically drugged if they have been trafficked for years and are drug dependent. Then they don't eat well and they are very physically weak. We also see that they have very few personal possessions and no official papers, or their stories and accounts are often false. And one of the issues we have with interpreters is that the criminal network will provide interpreters to speak on behalf of the victims, and it has been discovered in a couple of hospitals in Australia that the interpreters have lied about what the victim has said, and this has been picked up in one case study we had. The nurse that was attending another patient inside the same ward was the same nationality as the victim. She overheard the victim's statement, but the interpreter had falsified the conversation, and the nurse went to police as they left the room and told them that it was untrue. And this is how this case unraveled. So One of the interesting, most recent research I have been involved in is the role of women in organised crime and human trafficking as the offenders. As I said, Australia is in Southeast Asia, and one of the common functions for women in Southeast Asia is that they are in the market daily. They are the buyers and the sellers. So what we have noticed is there is a far higher number of women as offenders in our region than in some other regions of the world. And for decades, they have been ignored. Not only from the legal and procedural point of view, where some countries do not even have laws that cover women as offenders in this area, but also from day to day, where police will pass a group of women by because they cannot imagine that a woman could be an offender of this type. We currently have 28 cases between Thailand and Australia where women are the perpetrator of the human trafficking. All of those have been related to sex crimes as opposed to labour. And we have seen that the majority have used drugs, illicit drugs, to control the women. So basically, they become addicted to the drug and then are unable to survive without it. So how do we identify victims so that we can try to prevent this in the future? Firstly, we can look at who the victim is accompanied by, who is speaking on their behalf, and why are they not speaking freely. This we see in our airport and our shipping ports. This is a frequent way to identify. Another is that they are relocated or moved frequently and are not kept in one location for a long period. Excuse me, just bear with me. Also, when questioned using official legal interpreters, we find that there are strong inconsistencies in their story. And most frequently, they do not have control of their papers and or money. This is the most significant for us. One of the more modern things we see is a very strong restriction of the use of social networking and platforms such as Instagram and Facebook and so on. So from an Australian perspective, and I think internationally, it is pornography that drives the sexual servitude industry. It is because the demand is so high that now our supply is getting higher. For victims of this type of crime, they have as many psychological and mental health issues as they may have physical issues. In extreme cases, we have seen suicidal ideation. We have seen what is known as Stockholm Syndrome, where the victim then becomes friendly or wishes to remain with the offenders. They then distrust people trying to help them and suffer with post-traumatic stress disorder. We see that they have numerous medical conditions, and of course, specific to this industry is those that are sexually transmitted and tragically in children, unwanted pregnancies. We see that new platforms like OnlyFans in the US, cam girls. In Australia, definitely OnlyFans and TikTok are becoming a platform for where the girls are exploited. As you can see by the bullet point number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 here, they may in fact begin as a willing participant in some of this, but then particularly if it's through a romantic link, their partner may say, I would like you to do this for me. I would like you to allow me to film you dancing, stripping, sex, whatever. But then they are manipulated using that when the person passes the image or the film on. What we have noticed, particularly when we are receiving trafficked victims from Asia, is that for many of them, they are being sold by their family or relatives. Most recently for me, it was a 12-year-old girl whose family had passed away, mother and father, so she was orphaned, and she went to live with an auntie and an elderly relative, but combined with herself and siblings and that family's children, there were 15 children, so the family could not afford to keep them, and they sold the 3 eldest children in the family. What they believed they were doing was selling the children to a group of people who created clothing, and that the children would learn to work in a commercial sewing business. But this was not true, and very, very quickly, within about 72 hours of being collected, the children were delivered to a major city and sold into the sex trade. So I'm actually about halfway. Oscar, I should have stopped earlier to check with you that this is working okay. I'm sorry, I got carried away. Good, okay. So I would like you to think now in the audience about where the clothes come from that you are currently wearing. Do you know the source of these clothing? Did you or a relative make them, or did you purchase them from a store? This is a question I ask many of my students, because what we have discovered is most people have no idea where their clothing comes from. This is important to us, particularly here in Australia, because we have very, very little manufacturing here. This is because I believe is because that our cost of living and our wages are quite high. We are, in terms of comparison to the world, we are very well off, I believe. Even though we have levels of very wealthy people, the bulk of people in the middle are moderate, and then we have people who are very poor, but the majority of people live there in the moderate income. And what happens is, to manufacture here in Australia, it would put the cost of clothing substantially higher than it is now. I am afraid I do not know anything about money in Mexico, but for us, an Australian dollar sits about slightly less than the American dollar, I believe. But we can buy a dress like I'm wearing now for between $25 and $85, depending on its brand. but some of our large, I'm guessing like Kmart or Walmart, or I'm hoping I speak of a store that you might know, but a large department store, you can buy a t-shirt for $2 or $3. And in Australia, we have to pay like $5 or $6 for one cup of coffee. So I hope that gives you an idea of the cost. So if we buy our t-shirt in from China, from Thailand, from Myanmar or Burma, as you may know it, these people are earning just cents on the dollar for sitting in a relatively uncomfortable place, making thousands and thousands of products a day en masse. And we then wait for things to go on sale to make a better price. The problem we have with this in particular in our area is our government is not happy to create manufacturing here because they know that many people will still choose much cheaper imported product. So the demand is still very high, and of course these poor souls are the suppliers. For forced labour, from our point of view, we have three main means of control. The first is force, and in this we can talk about things like kidnap, torture, battery, threats of a weapon, sexual assault, confinement, forced use of drugs where the person will become dependent on the drug and therefore the person who gives them the drugs, and things such as the denial of medical care. From the point of fraud, you also have promises of valid immigration. They promise documents where some of our people are paperless. The offender will promise to get them papers, and if they come with them. The victims are told to use false travel documents. They are contracted to do legitimate work, but the financial benefit to them is much less. They are promised jobs that do not exist. They are misrepresented in terms of work conditions, and in terms of when it is labour related to relationships where a person may romantically meet with someone and then say, oh, you might like to work with us, or I could get you a better job or whatever, that is also a fraudulent thing. From the coercion point of view, we have what is on the screen, but debt bondage, the control of children, threats and control of communications, psychological abuse, punishment for misbehaviour, and some of the things we've seen recently are a fine for not doing something. So the person may only make, let's pretend, maybe $10 a day, and if they misbehave or back answer or something, the money is reduced and they are fined for this. So it forces and coerces the person to behave in the way the person, the offender, wishes them to be. We see less of the chaining, as I said you, the literal one. We see less of this, but we do see a lot of locked rooms. Some of the major federal police investigations have found people that have been locked into rooms, but where there are around about 15 people to a room. They are not given ability to go to the restroom, and certainly not paid well at all. I want to give you an idea of how big Australia is if you have not visited us. And I'm afraid I can see it's a little bit blurry, but you will see that the whole of South Africa, Thailand, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, Portugal, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, and many, many more countries fit into our one continent. So when I talk to you about it being difficult to investigate and to prevent labour trafficking here, you may understand because of the enormity of our space, and I have placed here a map for you. The darker colour in the green is the inner regions, which really follow our coastlines here. Then you have the slightly lighter green again. This is the inner regions. But basically, this entire area here is considered very, very remote. So I listed here some of the issues for us and why labour trafficking is becoming much, much bigger here. We have very significant shortages of people who wish to work in rural and regional Australia. This is right from people who wish to work on farms, cleaners, teachers, nurses, through to doctors, lawyers, people who collect garbage, everything. We have very few people who will go out to the regional areas. And so we talk about, well, what happens when we have migration or trafficking or slavery coming in. What happens is people fly into Sydney, and you can see Sydney here in our southern area here in New South Wales, and then they are collected by the offending group and they are moved, and it's usually for us would be out into the top end of New South Wales, bordering into Queensland in this area here. To give you an idea, one of our farms in South Australia, Oscar, just tell me, can you see my cursor moving on this map here? Does it show me? Yes, beautiful. Okay, so one of the farms that is in approximately this area here, it is called Anne Station, A-N-N-E, Anne Station. It is the size of the United Kingdom, one farm. And it is absolutely enormous. And I think to give you that perspective is why we struggle with trying to not only prevent it but investigate, but also to protect these victims, because they come here truly believing that they are going to have a better life. I have met some people who said I came from Afghanistan and it is a million times better, even though it is nowhere near the standard that I personally would expect for them, because they are still worked too hard. They do not have enough protection for their own health and well-being. So it is a balancing act as well, because I do not want to harm them by pushing harder that they should have more, but I do not want to allow people to exploit them. I have put questions here about, should Australia invest in a guest workers scheme? This is something that we have been considering for some period of time, where we could invite people in and they would have that protection and they would be on the radar of not only police, but what we have is the Fair Work Ombudsman, which is a large Commonwealth group who look after the worker. So some of the responses that we have had have been really interesting, and I have kept these ones here specifically to discuss with you. One of them that I have not listed there but has been the biggest surprise for me is that they do not see themselves as victims. And this is particularly in relation to the labour exploitation. Some families that I have known that have come from the war-torn Afghanistan area have come here, moved to a regional area, a rural area, and they have a small home. They have food every day. They have the right to their religious identity. They are free in the sense that they are not coming to any harm through the war or anything that they left. However, by Australian standards, they are not getting the amount of money that they should have, and they are not as free as I think they should be, because they can't leave this large farm without permission, and they can only go so far because they do not hold a driver's license or have the ability to have a car. So when I speak to them, they are just grateful. They speak of being thankful. The parents speak of thankful that their children will be raised in a place of peace. But when I think of the victim, their response, and I do consider them victims, because the reason I know that they exist is because police found them in a situation where they had papers removed and they were being made to work, perhaps not coerced, but made to work in very difficult circumstances. But looking down this list here, some of the things we talked about earlier in terms of the sexual exploitation is that they do not have meaningful social networks. So because they have been isolated from family and friends, they no longer have the means to connect to people, to understand whether what they're feeling or going through is the same or different than other people. Because they were economically motivated to go and get a new job, they are embarrassed by the fact that they have been caught up in this situation. They are ashamed, particularly if it's in relation to sex, and obviously the threats of blackmail and the threats against their life, as well as if you don't do this, or I will show people what you have done, and so on. So we have often been asked, right from government to students that I teach and everything, why don't they leave? And I'm sure if you are studying victimology, you may have heard this when we talk about victims of family and domestic violence. Why don't they just leave? Well, in many cases, they are afraid of being deported. And in many of the countries that come here, they are leaving civil unrest and or war-torn countries. Recently, we have had Syria, Ukraine, Turkey, Lebanon, and so on. So these are people that are very afraid of being sent back. So they would they don't prefer, but they are going to stay instead of trying to leave and go home. They are afraid of being arrested and put in prison. This is a big one for people who are coming from countries where arrest also equals beatings, rape, threats of violence against their family or their friends. They also may feel that they are literally in danger if they try to leave, because they may have witnessed that person who they knew in the group of sexually trafficked people has either been beaten or disappeared. So they look at it and think, I'm not going to risk that. The concept of having that Stockholm syndrome that I spoke about, the psychological hold, or a physiological hold where the victim has become dependent on usually drugs, and they need to stay with the trafficker to continue to have those drugs. They fear or have had threats against the safety of their families. For the ones that I know about coming from Myanmar, it is, we know where you live and we know you have 2 younger sisters. If you do not behave, if you do not do as you are told, we are going to attack those girls and we are going to harm them. And also, they may not be able to financially support or physically support themselves if they go alone. And this we see very much with very young people. So they leave home or have been removed from home at around 13 and are immediately being harmed, whether sexually, physically, psychologically. And they look at it and go, well, if I leave, I've got nowhere to go. I have no means of work, money, and so on. And if they are unpapered or not citizens of the country that they are in, they can't get welfare or assistance. And of course, going to police, they may fear how the police will react. So we often, in this industry, we talk a lot about violence and about how well police do or our social services. And I often ask them, how do you measure your success? Before I go into that, I guess I think about this is always a violent crime because forcibly trafficking someone or removing them from where they are is a complex and multifaceted phenomenon. It does vary, as I've said, across regions and society. It's shaped from cultural, historical, and socioeconomic factors. Comparative perspectives on this violence become valuable to understand how our societies perceive it, how they respond to it, and how they mitigate these behaviours. So when I teach about measuring success, I talk to my students about if you wish the success to be prosecution, we have very, very poor prosecution rates. In Australia, under 2%, which is terrible. It got up to 6%, but unfortunately, it has reduced down. So I suspect, I hope this helps you if you end up moving into this area or any other. If you become a psychologist, a victimologist, a doctor, or anywhere where you work with people, we really have to look at and evaluate how we measure our success, because it cannot just be about solving a crime or solving a problem. Because if that was the case, this is my 30th year as a victimologist. And although I see wonderful, beautiful change, I also see real trouble and very complex problems, particularly politically, where we cannot get our governments to listen, or one does and the other doesn't. So measuring success is things for me personally, like do no further harm. Always listen. And as I wrote here, truth is in understanding what this person is telling you. But things like courage during adversity. This is so important to me. Courage can only be revealed for me personally when it is required, and only those who display it and act upon it during adversity lay claim to its possession. Adversity comes in many different forms, but courage always looks the same to me. I think graciousness towards others and kindness, looking at how we extend peace to another person, particularly when they have been so harmed and are so mistrustful. Thinking about integrity and our ethics, our personal ethics, living with optimism and trying to understand how to share optimism with somebody who has been so terribly harmed. Another is respecting authority. And I must say, I smile because sometimes I disrespect authority because I think, oh, please work harder, do more. But I think from what I have seen here in Australia, authority brings order to our country where there would be disorder without it. So I try to be a little bit more gracious around that. Also, apologize. And I know it sounds strange, but I often talk to people and say, I am terribly sorry. I cannot imagine how it feels. And I allow them to speak and allow them to tell me what it is that they need from this process, because it is very easy for me as a professional to say, well, I think you should do this, this, and this, but it is so individual. It is better to say to the person, how can I help you? What can I do for you? And as I said, this is across many, many professions, including Oscar, including us teachers. How can I help you learn better? How can I help you want more from us? And in that sense, when we talk about trafficking and sexual exploitation and labour, all that, I also think about how we manage our victims. And forgive me, I'm even struggling with the term about managing a victim. What I mean by that is not coercing or forcing them into being managed, but managing their expectation. When they are found by police or medical services, for many of us, we find them through a doctor or a nurse in a hospital where the doctor may raise that they think there's something else behind the illness, and this opens an investigation. But what we do is we try to offer, I'm going to say, the basics. So as you can see here, clothing, food, and safety. For me, this is one of the first questions we ask. And if we can, in their native language, are you safe? Or do you wish us to help you with something other than what you're here for? So we have seen, as an example, an assault, and it broke the eye socket here of the victim. When the doctor came in, unfortunately, they are a very busy person, and they just kind of went, you need this medicine, this x-ray, this, and this was it. It wasn't until the nurse came to organise for the x-ray to be done, they noticed other signs on the person that made them question whether this was an accident or in fact part of a family and domestic violence or a trafficking incident. It turned out it was trafficking, and it was just the slow communication of the nurse to give the person time to make a decision to show other wounds, to speak privately about the harm that had been done to them. And of course, then police were involved and so on. But we talk also about the critical need for mental health, because I truly believe at least 100% of our victims need mental health care, even if they were found within the first week, for example, of being trafficked, which is not common, of course, but even if they were, because you must try to imagine the fear of realizing that you have been either abducted or coerced or manipulated into something else that you believed. And there comes with that a true fear and I would think anxiety, certainly depression, and long term, if you also have the additions of drug and alcohol, substance abuses, sexual abuses, and so on, you will very much need to assist managing this victim's mental health care. So we're up to the last two slides, so I'll get through those and then we can have a chat. We use the three major P's: prevention, protection, and prosecution. I break those up into victim services, training, law enforcement, awareness, and protocols. Protocols are looking at creating and evaluating protocols to help task force and create procedures for handling human trafficking situations. In terms of awareness, we look at community organisation and creating partnerships in our community, particularly with other nationalities where we can utilise their cultural understanding, religious beliefs, and of course language skills. It provides outreach and education to their community related to human trafficking so that they can come to us in trust if they are aware of somebody related to their community that is being harmed. In terms of law enforcement, we have collaborations where we do current and future training and investigations together in partnership, and we teach prevention tactics so that even when they are in an investigation where they can actually see what is going on, we teach them to look forward and to look out and to see whether there are any other connections, whether there are any other networks, whether other countries could be involved, and so on. And the final slide, I guess. I like this one, and I chose it specifically because be careful what you pay for, I guess. And you can see the image, sale of free female with every purchase. When I think about this, and I think about the questions I asked you about, where do our clothes come from? You know, where does the film come from? How does this really work in reality? I think we need to consider tackling this both at a national level and an international level. We have the UN conventions, and we have the protocols to try and prevent or suppress and punish traffickers, but we still have this grassroots community idea that it's not my problem, that I didn't do anything wrong, that, you know, and so on. So we need to come down, and maybe we talk about top down, and we might have to do bottom up at the same time. At a national level, certainly the work we've done in Australia continues to implement protocols and works towards integrating anti-human trafficking legislation into our domestic laws. There's annual improvements in the number of the countries that work with these legislations, as well as specific anti-human trafficking policing units, national action plans to deal with these issues. I think that from a perspective of being victim-centric, we've come a long way. We reach out in partnerships to places like the Red Cross and both local and international groups to help us understand what more we can do to assist these victims after they've been identified. So I hope that has been of help to you. And Oscar, over to you.
Initially, when you talk about victims, and of course, they sometimes don't realize the real experience they are facing. They say probably it's just a work, it's just a labor, it's just a normal duty. How many of those victims were initially, probably before they engage in this victimization context, how many of them could have been polyvictims in their early life, for example? Have you
Most.
ever traced some
Yeah.
of this?
Yes. It is mostly, the majority are poly victims. Where we see everything from a violent home life, and there's a lot of gender inequity. So the young women and girls are not educated as well as our boys. So there's, a lot of that goes on. And I think it makes victimization of trafficking even easier for the offender because the person is not as worldly and not capable necessarily of seeing the possibility of a crime occurring again or still.
Ale, adelante.
No, te quería decir si igual y me puedes poner otra vez como traductora para sus respuestas.
Ok, sí, claro. Deja, habilito. Okay, she's going to translate. Ok, ¿alguna pregunta por ahí? Había visto a alguien, Miguel Ángel, me parece que había levantado su mano. Sí.
Sí, profe, era yo. Como vi una mano levantada antes que yo la bajé. Se me escucha correcto, ¿verdad?
Perfecto.
Okay. Hi. I have a question.
Hello.
Nice to meet you.
You too.
I have a question about you say something earlier that about you show a map of Mexico being there as main country of human traffic. I want to ask, how does culture influence in this crime?
Yeah, so broadly speaking, and I would suggest the same for Mexico, is that if you have inequity, whether it's social, economic, gendered, you will always have differences or minority groups or people who become more vulnerable. So imagine being, for example, a very poor female in a rural area of Mexico. It is more likely that that person is highly vulnerable to trafficking than perhaps a young female in your university. From a cultural perspective, I think that it is very complex because our cultures are rich and beautiful and strong and, you know, weave through our history. However, sometimes we neglect to see the offenders using our culture against us, using it against the most vulnerable in the population.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I asked a question because here in Mexico we have had trouble about high rates of children and women and in this kind of crime, and there's a lack of persecution, as you say, of this kind of crimes here in Mexico by the government. So
yes,
I wonder that the culture is kind of a risk factor, as I say, because it's a huge problem right here and right now. But thank you so much. That helps me a lot.
pleasure. Thank you, Miguel.
if you would, what would you say about trafficking being a gendered problem? Talking about re-victimization, because here in Mexico, there's a lot of re-victimization when it comes to trafficking, and it's broadening and stretching the fact that in Australia, it's a little bit similar with these networks that work on trafficking.
It's an interesting question. I think gender and re-victimization is one of the most common.
Sorry.
Okay.
Continue, sorry.
Please, that's okay. It is one of the most common problems because if you're thinking about young women and girls, they are still considered, in terms of gender equity, less than a male in most or many countries of the world. And even if they have been victimized and return back to their hometown or to the area, what we see is that they enter back into a very similar situation. They are in the same space with the same problems, with the same inequity and so on. So we see them continuing this downward spiral because they are suffering with shame, guilt, or whatever. Their families still are not well enough to, or well off enough to keep many people or children. They are sometimes shocked about what has happened, but for the majority of the victims I know, they do not return to their family. They return to another area because of the shame and worry, and they return to the same problem. So re-victimization, particularly in Southeast Asia, is very common.
As you said before about the gender issues and the gender gaps in this type of victimization context, I also would like to ask why in some forms of trafficking, such as sexual trafficking, there's a clear gendered issue that, for example, if we take into account organized crimes forms based on criminal enterprises about drugs and things like that, is completely different, the role of women, rather than sexual exploitation, for example. And it seems that women play an enormous or relevant role when they even groom other victims, or they are selected as groomers in this case. But what can be a proper reason of why gender in this context matter, and also we have a clear evidence about the role of women who perpetrates that type of victimization context, instead of criminal enterprises related to drug dealing and transportation and those sort of things.
It's a very, very complex question, actually. Thank you, Oscar. I think the first one is that, as I mentioned, it's only recently that we have really considered the role of women as offenders, because for decades we have looked at sexual exploitation as the gender inequity for women and girls, and they become the victim. I think there are two things. One is supply and demand. So the reason that gender equity exists is the demand for online sex services and physical sex services majority of the purchasers are male, and they are purchasing females. So we have an inequity there to start with, and the demand is extremely high, and the pool has become much bigger with such things as abject poverty, the COVID-19 coronavirus, the lack of government answers to education and employment, particularly for women. This is the cultural aspect again, where for many cultures, the mother remains at home with the children and so on. But we do not account for what happens if the husband leaves or passes away or whatever, and leaves the mother with the children. If there is no welfare system and so on, they must attain another role. And in saying that, we then see the role of women as offenders. Certainly in our work, we see them as either previous victims themselves, and they have decided, well, I can't go backwards, and there's a lot of money here, and I've survived, so I may as well become and benefit from this crime. We see them as coerced as well. So in some cases, yeah, and particularly in the larger network or organised crime, the women are forced to get other women. So we know in some work I've been looking at in the Ukraine, with the Ukraine-Russia war, that they're saying to one woman, if you bring 2 women in, we free you. And of course, the women say, I couldn't put anyone else through this, but then they're raped, beaten, threatened, whatever, and they can't survive it. So they get 2 more women in, and allegedly they're going to be let go. It doesn't happen. Now they have 3, yeah, so on. So I think, yeah, we are researching now the role of women as offenders, and I actually would love to do some work with you for maybe Australia and Mexico and your students in the same role. But I think it is definitely based on, the 3 things: the inequity in our society, the inability of the government to be interested and or fix their problems related to education, poverty and employment, but also the supply and the demand issue.
All right, thank you so much. I also would like to make an intersection about both topics you have researched about. The one, human trafficking, but the second, in cases of homicide or even feminicide, solvability. Do they differ? For example, if you see human trafficking based homicide rather than a more interpersonal homicide, for example, intimate partner homicide, femicide, have you ever think about or even obtain data about some differences about homicide solvability factors or rates or things like that?
I have. So 2 parts to the question. Yes, I have considered it. We do not have data. The reason is we have not yet directly linked a homicide to a human trafficking, although I truly believe they exist. We don't have that connection yet. But from the solvability factors, I think there would be some that would be very specific to human trafficking, because the concept of trafficking must be that it is hidden, that that it is done, if you like, how to explain it, to continue to make the profit, to traffic these people, you can't get caught. So this detection avoidance leads us to very specific solvability factors. But the answer is I would love to research it, and if you're free next year, we could do it together.
Yeah, absolutely. I will be delighted to do. this type of research. And probably just last question. Um, and I would like to back in the initial question about the gender gaps. You say information and you establish information about coercive control and how coercive control plays an enormous role in this type of sexual exploitation, for example. Um, if we analyze types or forms that coercive control are expressed in this context, is grooming probably the prevalent factor in these cases?
Yes, yes, I'd agree with that. They must spend significant time, usually, particularly if they're trying to attract a very young woman. And I'm talking tragically 12, 13, 14. This is the area I'm talking. They spend a lot of time online. We see them through the platforms I mentioned, things like TikTok and OnlyFans and Facebook and so on, perhaps more so than ones that would be directly linked to, say, pornography or so on. So these are much more contemporary and much more open to just anybody using, yes? And what they do is they talk about, oh, you're so beautiful, you should, when you leave school, become a model. Or, that color is beautiful on you, all small things. But what happens is they are able to understand and take more information from the young child or the young woman than the child or woman realizes they're giving up. So things like, I would love to give you a birthday gift, or I would love to meet you and take you to your favorite restaurant. Now they know where they live, what their favorite food is, when their birthday is, and so on. This coercive control then builds when they start to go, but I love you more than your parents love you, or I am able to give you money, a home, a job, a university degree, whatever it is. And they are very, very good at manipulating the victim to take this information on. And in some cases, we've heard of young women in the sort of 17, 18-year-old are on the phone for 4, 5, 6 hours a day with these people, believing that a relationship is developing. And then, we realize things like, would you share a photo with me, an intimate photo? And then the girl, no, I don't do that. Oh, no, I know you're a lady. I know you're a good girl, and so on. But then they try another way. And eventually we usually see something similar. And then the control is then, right now, if you do anything, if you say anything, I will show this to your parents. I know your father's name. And it could be that they've linked all the information and then got a public record of who dad is or whatever. It's terrible.